Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. We're sponsored this week by Heirloom Roses. Visit them online at heirloomroses.com. Don, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing great. Our lawn is beautiful, the best it's looked in 3 years, nice and green.
It's been great, steady rain, not
and
too
of course,
hot.
You know, I like that because lawns give back to us.
Yeah.
You know, a 5 by 5 foot area produces enough oxygen for a person for a day.
Yeah.
So I'm well oxygenated. and I mean the iris. I was deadheading iris. They were beautiful. You know,
it was a great
deadheading,
season.
cutting off the old spent, and the peonies were really, really good this year. Lasted long. I made a mental note that next year I have to get some stakes. We mentioned that grid type thing that a peony can grow up through because some of the varieties that I've got are the old-fashioned ploppers.
Yeah.
How's that for a technical term for a peony? Ploppers.
Yes.
Those that just, you know, the best part, the best blossoms are all hanging near the ground. And I need to next year, get in place something that is going to hold them upright because they're so beautiful. So it's fun. You know, we can all make mental notes this time of year, are things that we should do differently for next year.
Yep.
So preventing my peony ploppers is on my to-do list.
Speaking of your yard, I gotta share a story with you. I was at a concert the other night. I was reviewing Tiger Lily Gold at Sanctuary Event Center in downtown Fargo, and I'm sitting there between the first act and then Tiger Lily Gold. The first act, Annabelle Maher from Fargo, great singer, and this guy comes up to me. I would say he was maybe like around 30, late 20s, early 30s, and he comes up to me and says, "John Lamb?" I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I just want to say I love listening to your podcast with Don Kinsler." And I thought, oh,
nice.
Oh, that's great. I rarely have people that I don't know come up to me and, talk about the podcast. I'm like, that's great. And he said, "I ride bike past Don's house all the time." I didn't get this guy's name, but to that bike rider out there who goes past Don's house all the time, if Don's ever out in the yard, feel free. I'm going to invite him into your yard. I think you would have had the same thing, but I think he should stop by and say hi and to say,
that would be awesome. In fact, I'm even going to give my address. How does that be? My wife and I live in South Fargo, 6313, 6313, 27th Street South, Fargo. And if you know where the St. Angelican Catholic Church and Shanley High School, we're just south of that a little ways. And so anyway, if I'm out working in the front yard, feel free, stop by. We'll chat a little bit, and of course, all of our yards are under, they're works in progress.
Everybody.
So I don't have every weed out, but
Sure.
I'm working at it. But yeah, if I'm out in the front yard weeding or doing something, stop by. It's always fun to chat.
And that's the thing about our yards is that while we will always dismiss it and say, I talked to a great gardener the other night, Terry Adams, and I asked him about his
wonderful yard.
He's got a great front yard. And I said, "Terry, your yard's looking great." He said, "No, it's not. The peonies are flopped. Everything, things won't look good until the dahlias come in." I'm like, in general, it looks great. And that's the thing.
I think some of us are more critical of our yard than anyone else.
But you know what else? We're always happy to talk about it because it's what we spend our time doing. It's a passion. It's something that we love. And
exactly. It's interesting. I enjoy our yard, but in my mind, I can see how much better it will be. So keep working at it. And
there's always room to do
if I'm
more.
out in the front yard, feel free to stop by and say hi. I always enjoy visiting.
Speaking of yards, again, let's talk about something that will be in not everybody's yard, but some people's yard. With 4th of July right around the corner, we're thinking apple pies. We're going to need our apple trees to be in good shape. That
was a good segue.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kind of 4th of July, America, motherhood, apple pie. Yeah, apples.
Apples, great.
That was clever, John.
But this is really kind of a big time for apple tree. And we tend to think of apples that you think of the harvest, but before the harvest, there's some things that we need to do to make sure that we have
it might seem like an odd time to be talking about apple trees here at the end of June because, they aren't blooming anymore or we aren't near harvest yet. And so why are we talking about apples? But there are a couple of very, very important things that we need to do towards the end of June here. early July in order to make that apple harvest good. Also, there are some things that we need to do to ensure that our apple trees stay healthy for years to come.
Yeah, so let's talk about why is June such a critical time?
Yeah, okay, a couple of things. First of all, when you take a look at an apple tree that has started to bear, and now that's another interesting question. How long does it take a newly planted apple tree to start giving you apples?
Yeah.
Okay, on average, it's 5 to 7 years. Now, you might get a couple little apples forming before that, but in the commercial orchards, if they are starting to get a few apples forming before that, about 5 years, they will physically remove those apples because those apples are a drain on the energy, and they're in it for the long haul, as we should be. And so if you do get a couple scattered little apples before that 5-year mark, it's actually probably better for the tree to remove those. So for anybody that has a younger apple tree, it's hard to do that because you want that first taste of whatever that apple is going to be.
Is that kind of like along the lines of when we were talking about peonies last
Definitely.
week, that the first couple of years, if you see buds coming, just give them a little snip off.
Yep, on a little newly developing peony, if it has those buds on it, you can just almost sense that, boy, that little peony is having to put a lot of energy into those flower buds. Yeah, very same principle as the apple trees. So anyway, if your apple tree has started to bear, if it's in the 5-year, some take up to 7 years. A Honeycrisp, Harrelson can often take 7, sometimes 9 years. So, but patience is rewarded. So if your apple tree is starting to bear fruit, if it's in that age, there's an important process called thinning of the apple crop. Now, and by thinning, we mean physically pulling off, removing some of the apple crop. Now, why would you possibly want to do that? Apples have a way of setting too many apples in a cluster. So if you take a look at an apple tree, sometimes there will be 5, 6 apples kind of all close in a cluster. And so what the commercial orchards do and what we should do is and this would be best done when the apples, little developing apples, are about dime size. So we're maybe a little beyond that. It'll vary with the variety, but we can still do this. Okay, we can thin them. So it would have been nice if they were done by dime size. Some of mine are a little beyond, but I'm still going to do this. So what we do is just physically with your fingers or a pruning shears, remove some of those apples out of those clusters so that they're spaced more like 3 inches apart. This is going to do a couple of things. If there's a few less apples, the sap of the tree is going to go into a few fewer apples, so the apples are going to be bigger. They'll be higher quality, maybe more flavor, more sugars, so the tree isn't having to spread itself so thin. Okay, so less apples, they'll be bigger and better. But also, that will help prevent branch breakage. We've probably all seen or heard about apple trees that have been so loaded. The branches have been so loaded with apples that they just break down, or you've needed to prop them up with a 2x4 or something to keep them from splitting off. And so removing some of those excess fruit will help prevent damage to that tree. And of course, if a branch splits off, that's irreversible. The other thing that thinning out a heavy crop is going to do is it will help save a little bit of that tree's energy for next year.
Oh, okay.
Some varieties of apple trees, such as Harrelson and Honeycrisp to a certain point, they get into a habit called biennial bearing, where they'll have a heavy fruit crop. Then the next year they rest. They've spent all their energy and they got to rest for a year. And then the following year they'll have a heavier crop. And it's kind of disappointing not to have apples every year. So when you thin out the apple crop, the tree will conserve some of its energy. And thinning out the apple crop will tend to even out those apple crops. So you'll get apples each year, instead of the boom or bust cycle of them. So thinning out apples does that. And even if your apples are a little beyond dime size at this point, you can still go ahead. So what you remove is the crowded ones. If any have little kind of marks or mars on them, go ahead, take those off. But the idea is about 3 inches apart on those. So that's a very important thing that we should be doing now. And if you haven't taken off the tree wrap, fruit trees apple trees, plum trees are all very susceptible to winter sun scald. Now, in the same way that a skier can get a sunburn in the wintertime, the sun reflecting off the snow and skiers get sunburn, apple trees can suffer that same thing. The bright sunshine reflecting off the snow can warm up the bark of an apple tree and give it a sunburn. And then, of course, when the sun goes down, those cells freeze again, rupture, and it develops I think called kind of a canker is the tree term for it, a damage, a wound, and that isn't really reversible. That's one of the main killers of apple trees. So especially when a tree is young, apple tree is young with thin bark, it's important to wrap that tree every fall, November or so, but it's also important to take that wrap off in the spring or early summer. So if you haven't taken the wrap off your tree, apple tree, do it now, because during the summertime, that trunk, the bark has to be exposed to the air, and the summer sun isn't damaging to it the way the winter sun is. And so otherwise, if you keep the wrap on, insects could hide underneath and be nibbling on the bark, or rot, moisture and things could get underneath. So take the wrap off for the summertime.
All right, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, let's talk about some of those insects and ways to keep them at bay.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Okay, we're back and we're talking about apple trees. And one of the things that we talked about taking the wrap off the tree, one of the things we should also mention too, is that it's really important to, especially around newer trees, to have a little bit of a ring of mulch around the trees, especially in the spring and summer, and kind of do that donut shape a little bit, mulch or wood chip, something like that, to both to help retain moisture in the area.
And that mulch is so important. It does a couple of things around an apple tree. It helps keep the grass suppressed in a way, because grass is a heavy feeder, and grass is kind of a hog. It takes the moisture, takes the nutrients, and so if we can keep that away from the apple tree, and also if grass is growing too close to a trunk, such as an apple tree, when you go to mow, it's tempting to get really, really close, or as a string trimmer. I've seen so many young trees killed with string trimmers, so just the ring of mulch makes it so much easier to mulch. If you currently have grass around an apple tree, what I found is a really nice, handy way to mulch is just mow the grass really short in a circle around. You don't even have to remove the grass, but just lay cardboard down, overlapping in a circle around the 3 to 5 feet in a circle around the apple tree, and then cover that with shredded bark. Then it won't look goofy, and the cardboard won't be blowing off, and the grass underneath will just die and decay, so you don't even have to remove the grass. So easy way to mulch around.
Well, we started talking a little bit about insects with apple trees, and I would think that that's a big problem. We think of any kind of a fruit tree, we think that they're going to attract bugs. But with apples, what are the insects we have to worry about with apple trees?
The number one insect on apple trees all across the region is the apple maggot. Now, we don't see the apple maggot. We don't even know it's there bothering the apples until harvest time. Your apples may look really nice from the outside, but when you go to cut open the apple or take a bite out of it, you'll see brown streaks. And each year I get emails at harvest time that people cut open an apple and wonder, what is this browning streak? And what that is the apple maggot. Again, it's very, very common on apples. And that is starting in late June or early July. So we're at just the prime time to prevent this. So what happens is the adult fly, which is a little kind of a black fruit fly type thing, it lays eggs on the developing fruit. It actually punctures through the skin of the apple, lays its eggs, the egg hatches into a little larvae, and then that larvae spends its summer inside that developing apple. So as the apple enlarges, the little maggot, the little larvae, goes through, tunnels through, and causes all these brown streaks. Now, by the time that you harvest the apple, that little maggot, that little larvae is gone. It's not like you bite into an apple and find half a worm in there.
Right.
They aren't that big, but they're just little enough, and they cause all those brown streaks, and it really affects the usability of those apples.
I never thought about that, but that's probably where the phrase "rotten to the core" comes from.
Yes,
Okay,
definitely, because they will. Yeah, they go all the way to the core with these. So the apple maggot. So how do we prevent the apple maggot, these little flies? Spray is the easiest, and a person needs to start the spray program the end of June or by the first part of July. It is weather dependent when these adult flies are going to be in the area. Now, if you've had problems with this in the past, those flies do winter in the soil, so they're emerging out of the soil. And again, they're a little black fruit fly. Some garden centers, or you can order them online, have traps. They're a round ball that's red in color, look like an apple.
Okay,
and
I've seen those.
You can hang those in the tree and coat them with a sticky material. Garden centers sell a sticky material called Tanglefoot. It's used for other things too. Sometimes it's called Tangle Trap. Well, you coat this red ball, apple-looking ball, with that sticky material, and you can use that as a gauge. It's not going to trap all the apple maggots and save your tree, but it will give you an indication when you start seeing these little black fruit flies being trapped into the sticky material. It's time to spray. Well, even if you don't have those traps, about the end of June here, even the 25th or so, or at the latest, the first part of July, start a spray program on yours. Okay, so what are we going to use to spray our apple tree? Check the label for something that is for apple maggots. The common insecticide malathion, spinosad, which is an organic type material. Or one thing I like to use is the garden centers have products called home orchard spray, which combines an insecticide with a fungicide. So if you've got some fungus type things going on with the leaves, it'll help prevent that as well. Now, it's very important to follow the label directions as to the timing. So those apple maggot adult flies are going to be active throughout the month of July and into August. So that means, following the label, every 7 to 10 days, we do need to apply the spray. Okay. So end of June, maybe middle of July, end of July at least, and maybe into August. So, we're maybe talking 4 to 6 sprays. So it's maybe not as bad as it sounds. So you could use one of the little, if your tree is smaller, kind of one of those little 2-gallon pump type sprayers. Mm-hmm. You could use that. Or another thing that's very handy are the hose end jars. Have you seen those? Have you ever used those, John? Yeah. The type, a sprayer that just screws onto the end of your garden hose, and then you dial the top. If the package says to use 2 ounces per gallon, you just dump the product in. You don't even have to dilute it. You just dial the top to the 2 ounces per gallon or whatever it says, and then just turn it on and spray. Now, it's important when spraying an apple tree, whatever sprayer you use, to get enough spray on. Spray the leaves and the developing fruit to the point where it's wet. Don't put on so much that it's raining off, but get the leaves and the apples to the point where it's all wet. And now, one nice thing about these sprays, we think, sprays, you're going to eat those apples, but these products, the reason you have to spray periodically is because these products break down. And that's why you need to apply them again. So when you follow the label directions, those sprays are going to be broken down and disappeared by the time you harvest and eat the apples. So they're quite safe to use. And let's see, what else about that? So a good spray routine is really important to keep those out because, again, it's really, really common. Couple of other things you can do to try to prevent this for future years. When apples drop, there's always apples that drop. Maybe they got blemishes, or the wasps or hornets or birds have started eating them, so then they drop off. Always take those up and remove those, because the little maggots that might be in those fallen apples, then the little maggot, after they are done in the apple, they crawl into the soil. So any sanitation that we could do, especially at the end of the season also, will prevent less maggots from exiting the apple, going down into the soil. Then they sit there over the winter, and then they emerge as flies next year to
Plus,
start
it's just kind of ungainly in your yard.
You
don't want
to have
and exactly
squishy apples.
And then you're also attracting other things,
deer,
and critters,
rabbits, raccoons,
just
wasps.
clean up.
Yeah. Exactly. So anyway, that's the main thing that when you hear people say they sprayed their apple tree, and should I spray my apple tree? It's for the apple maggot is the main thing. And we're trying to keep our apples nice and clean inside, so that we don't have all those streaks.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about we talk about this too, that all the time, is that the biggest tool in gardening is patience.
Yes,
and especially if you've got an apple tree that's not going to bear fruit for 7 to 9 years. It would be such a shame if you have a tree that's going to bear fruit in 7 to 9 years, and you get to that point where you're waiting for an apple, and the end of the season, all your apples are ruined.
Yeah,
and then if
have brown streaks in.
And if you know that it's going to be another 2 years until you get another harvest, so it is really something that you just have to kind of
patience and prevention.
Patience, prevention, stay on it, and it's an investment, as so much of gardening is.
It is, and really it doesn't take that long, especially with those hose end type sprayers. It really doesn't take that long to spray an apple tree. And sometimes it sounds like kind of a daunting task. Boy, spray a tree way up in there. But by doing pruning each year, the recommended height that we could keep our apple trees at is around 12 feet, so we can pick them. So we don't have this great big, huge, humongous apple tree that we can't reach the apples.
So would you do some of that on a stepladder, or will you still be able to reach it from the ground by spraying it up into the tree?
12 feet. Those, at most maybe a little stepladder, but usually with those sprayers, you could reach up to about a 12-foot height. If you haven't gotten your tree pruned, then it may be more of a challenge.
All right, let's take another little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about if it's still time to plant a tree.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back. We're talking about apple trees, and we've been talking about how to take care of your trees, that it's a good fruit producing tree. Is it, so people who are listening now, or people who've been thinking about this, there's so many more people now who are planting in their yard and on their property with the idea that they can create their food for themselves. When is a good time to plant an apple tree? Can you still plant one this year if you're hoping that?
Well, this is making me hungry for apples.
I know,
fresh off the tree apples. And it's fun to develop your yard into things that are edible. Sometimes we should do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah.
If we haven't already, designing landscaping with edibles.
Yep.
That'd be awesome. Well, there's still plenty of time to plant apple trees. So if we've inspired and you don't have an apple tree, and we can thank the plastic nursery pot, that humble plastic nursery pot that allows garden centers to have trees and shrubs, perennials on hand, because that plastic nursery pot allows the things to keep growing all season. So probably the least preferred time to plant anything, including apple trees, is the heat of the summer. Because just the heat itself, you can keep it watered, but the heat itself is kind of hard on things. But the end of June here, great time to plant. I really don't stop planting. And so, plenty of time to get an apple tree. And when you go to the locally owned garden centers, they'll have a number of different varieties well adapted to our area. And there's a fun thing about growing apples in our area. The Honeycrisp apple, for example. I've had people ask and discuss how come the Honeycrisp apples that they buy in the grocery store that are nice Washington, state of Washington Honeycrisp, how come they don't taste as good as the apples on their neighbor's Honeycrisp tree? And it's all about the coolness. See, in the fall of the year, when our weather starts getting cooler, the nighttime start getting nice and cool and crisp, maybe even a little bit of frost, which doesn't harm the apples on the tree. And the apples start developing sugars inside and the flavors start consolidating with that cool temperature. See, some of the other states, Washington, Oregon, don't have the coolness that helps consolidate those flavors and sugars within the apple. So we can grow better apples than they can in many other areas. And so shop the garden centers. There are at least 20 wonderful varieties that we can plant in our area. Of course, Honeycrisp gets a lot of the fame. Many people like
Minnesota's. It isn't it Minnesota's.
Developed in Minnesota, University of Minnesota.
Minnesota's own.
And Harrelson, an all-time favorite. That is, I believe, 100 years old now. The Harrelson, or approaching it, and that is such a good late apple. Stores well, pies. And one of my favorites is Prairie Magic, which is developed in Manitoba. That's a great one. So many, many good apple varieties, and the locally owned garden centers will have the good ones. So plenty of time. And so, it's interesting. Okay, you're looking at probably 5 years from which you should, but there's a wonderful old saying. The best time to plant an oak tree was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
The second best time is this afternoon. So same with apple trees. Yeah, I wish I had more, and we relocated, 8 years ago, but by the time we got everything done, we only got apple trees planted about 4 years ago.
Okay.
I think one of them's maybe 5 years. We're just starting to get to the point where we're going to have apple crop. And so, we have patience, but yes, better to get started now with it than to delay any longer.
That raises a good question. What I think is a good question, maybe it'll be a silly question, but because we're talking about if it's 5, 7, 9 years before a tree will bear fruit, do you still need to be spraying it for those pesticides? Because will there be an apple maggot if there's no apples on the tree?
They need apples.
Okay.
Yep.
So those first couple of years, you wouldn't necessarily need to do it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah. So if it doesn't have apples, the maggots are strictly looking for apples. So you don't need to spray your tree for the apple maggot anyway. If you've got other things chewing on the leaves, well then, probably a good idea to spray. Because sometimes you'll have other insects chewing on the leaves themselves that can be a separate side issue.
A little bit different, but what about crabapple trees? Do you need to spray crabapple trees if you're not going to use the crab apples?
Yeah, then you do not.
Okay.
They probably still have maggots, apple maggots in them. Although I think if I were an apple maggot, I think I'd go for a nice, juicy, bigger apple.
Right.
but I'm sure the crab apples probably have them also in it, and which might be a good reason for, if you have fruiting apples, to also in the fall clean up especially any of the older crabapple varieties that have bigger fruit. Probably a good idea. And usually you want to rake those up anyway because they make the yard awfully mushy.
Yeah. One last question. Let's talk about this. How long will an apple tree last?
I wish apple trees lasted 100 years. And there are individual apple trees that have lasted 100 years. In our area, the average lifespan of an apple tree seems to be about 25 years. I wish it was longer, but after about 25 years, they do start developing some different problems, and they'll over time have less canopy, a thinner canopy. Things start happening kind of in the main trunks. And so, I wish they last 100 years, but that's okay. From the time they start bearing, 5 to 7 years, then up to about 25 years, you've got good production. So, when they start looking like they're going downhill, well, we plant another apple tree then and have good production. I don't know of anyone really that said, oh, shoot, I planted an apple tree and it lasted 25 years. I don't think I would have done it. I've never once heard that. You enjoy it during its productive life, And it's okay if the circle of life just does what the circle of life does. That's okay too.
Have you ever used apple wood from a?
That's awesome. Yes. Yeah. In fact, we had at our place it was a crab apple tree, not a really good fruiting one, but it died. But that's okay. I'm replacing it with a better fruiting apple tree, and now I've got apple wood. So for the charcoal and campfires, you can detect the aroma of apple wood. It's amazing.
They burn really well and they smell great.
Oh, yeah, man. Now you've got me hungry for, maybe a roast on the grill in which you put a few apple wood shavings on.
I'm thinking, I'm not going to wait till the 4th of July. I think I'm going to have an apple pie before then.
Oh, that sounds great.
Well, Don, if people have questions about their apple tree, if they want to send you pictures of their apples or their apple tree or anything in their yard, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinsler, spelled KINZLER, @ndsu.edu. And I always enjoy hearing from everyone. And thank you to those who have contacted us. It's always great to hear from you.
And like we said, if you're driving by, riding by, walking by Don's house and he's out in the yard.
If I'm out in the front, there's always weeds to pull. And so stop by and say hi.
All right. Well, Don, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, John. And thanks, everyone. Have a good week.